In this video, I'm going to talk about transport. How do you like to travel when making long trips? That's a tricky question because, on the one hand, I absolutely detest flying. However, on the other hand, if it is a long trip that I have to make, then it is by far the most convenient. I'd much rather travel by car or by ferry. When you are travelling by car, you get the opportunity to see wonderful scenery. Nonetheless, the downside of this mode of transport is that if there is heavy traffic, then you are likely to get delayed. Being stuck in a traffic jam can lead to road rage and is extremely stressful. You need to use fillers in your answer. These give you thinking time. So that's a tricky question. Tricky means difficult, and by using this filler, it's giving you some thinking time to think about the answer that you're going to give. On the one hand, in IELTS writing, this phrase is not really complex enough, but it's okay for IELTS speaking. I absolutely detest. This means I really hate, and is a much better way of saying it. Remember to use your discourse markers, because your IELTS examiner is listening for cohesion and coherence. On the other hand, again, not complex enough for IELTS writing, but fine for IELTS speaking. By far, to really stress that this is by a great amount. The most convenient. Here I'm using a superlative. Make sure you know how to use them correctly. Instead of saying I'd prefer to, you can say I'd much rather plus infinitive. Are travelling. The present continuous is a simple tense, but it's one that's often forgotten by IELTS candidates. Scenery. This is the natural features of a landscape, and we talk about the scenery as we're travelling. Nonetheless, instead of repeating however here, this is an alternative, a much more complex word. Downside. This means disadvantage, and again is a little bit more complex. Transport is uncountable, so we talk about modes of or means of transport. Here is a useful collocation, heavy traffic, and it means when there is lots of traffic. This is an example of a reduced adjective clause. Instead of saying if you are stuck, being stuck in a traffic jam. Road rage. This is when people get angry because of traffic problems or traffic congestion and they become angry or violent. Remember to avoid basic words such as very and use more complex ones such as extremely. In your country, what kind of transport is used for long trips? The majority of people tend to use airplanes when taking long-distance trips. In actual fact, it is often cheaper to fly long-haul than take a domestic flight. The roads are in a terrible state of disrepair in my country, therefore travelling by car is not ideal. Instead of saying most, you can say the majority of. Tend to plus infinitive is a useful verb. Tend to happen. Tend to do. And it means something usually happens. In actual fact, this is a useful little phrase and it's used to add emphasis to a comment. It modifies, it adds to, or it contradicts the previous statement. Here it's adding something which supports and emphasising the previous statement. We talk about long-haul flights and short-haul flights. Long-haul flights are flights that are over a long distance. A domestic flight is a flight within your own country. The roads are in a terrible state of disrepair. This means they're in a very bad condition. Remember to use discourse markers in both IELTS writing and speaking. Ideal means perfect. So here, travelling by car is not ideal. It means it's not perfect. How has transport changed in your country over the last 20 years? There are a number of ways in which transport has changed in the last 2 decades. Firstly, the number of cars on the road has increased exponentially. Therefore, the amount of congestion on the roads has mushroomed. Furthermore, the cost of fares of long-haul flights has decreased significantly. The growth of budget airlines has led to an increase in the number of flights being taken because it is more affordable than before. Remember to think of your answers in IELTS speaking like a mini essay. And if you think of them in this way, you will remember to use words and phrases to structure them. By starting your answer with this phrase, it shows you're going to give a number of reasons. There are a number of ways. In the last 2 decades, instead of repeating in the last 20 years from the question, the use of substitution here is good. Remember to use your discourse markers for your cohesion and coherence grades. So firstly, secondly, furthermore, moreover. To increase exponentially means to increase at a constant rate. When using uncountable nouns, we use the amount of, not the number of. Congestion is like traffic jams when you're travelling at a slower speed because of the amount of traffic on the roads. To mushroom means to increase, to spread or to develop rapidly. Fares. This is the money you pay for a journey on a bus, a train or a plane. As in the previous slide, long haul means a flight of a long distance, usually over about 4 hours. Budget airlines, these are low-cost airlines where you don't usually get food or you have a very small baggage allowance. Being taken. Here's a good example of a reduced relative clause. The phrase, which are taken, has been reduced to being taken. Affordable. Something's affordable, it's inexpensive. It's reasonably priced. What do you think will happen to the transport network in your country in the future? That's an interesting question. In the short term, I reckon nothing, because the government does not have enough money to focus on transport issues. However, in the long term, something will have to change because the situation cannot continue as it is. There is the massive environmental impact of having a nation teeming with cars. Policies need to be introduced to limit the number of vehicles on the road. Nevertheless, I cannot see that happening any time in the near future. In the short term and in the long term. These are a useful pair of phrases to talk about the situation now and in the future. I reckon. This is another way of saying I think, and it's quite informal, but it's good for IELTS speaking. Massive. Instead of using simple words such as big, use more complex ones such as this. A nation. Instead of using a country, a synonym has been used here. IELTS examiners are looking for examples of substitution. This means using other words to say the same thing. Teeming with, this means full of, teeming with people, teeming with cars. Policies need to be introduced. The use of a modal passive here will impress the IELTS examiner. Nevertheless, instead of repeating however, you could use a more complex alternative such as this. In the near future, instead of saying soon, this is a more complex way of saying it. We say in the near future for soon. Thank you for watching this video. Now do the vocabulary quiz to make sure that you've learnt the vocabulary.